Hello, everybody. Welcome to another open book tour. Today it's my honor to introduce Ed Marquand. Ed is the creator of some of the most beautiful art books that you will ever find in museums and galleries and architects' offices. Marquand editions are the top of art book production. Ed is not only a book designer, he is also a transformer. It has been said that he re-envisions unloved places and turns them into treasures. And this is certainly true of a store in Seattle called Paper Hammer that carries all kinds of paper-related goods and books. That had been an unloved space for sure. And most of all, he created the mighty Tieton, which is a small town in eastern Washington that certainly was unloved and on its last legs, and is now a thriving center for the production of books and other arts. But today, Ed will be talking about and sharing books that he created that are exceptional. I can't think of another word for them. Here is Ed Marquand.
Thank you. Thank you, Cynthia. Thank you, Amy. It's a real pleasure to be here, and thanks for the invitation. And I'm happy to be able to share two of the productions we've done in Tieton. Before we start, how many are book makers? How many are in book arts and actually do studio work? So most of you. Yeah, that's good to know. As Cynthia pointed out, my main job, profession, if you will, is publishing books for art museums. Over the years, we've worked with about 250 different art museums around the country, producing exhibition catalogs and collection books. I started the company in Seattle 40 years ago, and we now have a staff of 10. They're based in downtown Seattle, and if you're familiar with Paper Hammer, the shop, it's at 2nd and Union. There's a little door when you walk into Paper Hammer that says Lucia Marquand, and Lucia Marquand is the art book operation. I have a business partner in that endeavor. We have about 10 people who work there. They're editors and designers and production people. We produce probably 40 to 50 titles a year for museums all around the country. It's something I know very well, although I don't really do much in the way of design work there anymore. I do know the museum world very well. So my job is kind of arm waving and providing context for the staff about why these museums are producing these books, who are the important players, what's the scholarship that needs to be presented first and foremost, talk through issues of design. We connect museums with trade publishers for distribution, so these books can go into the world, into bookstores and Amazon and so on. We probably produce more books for Yale University Press than any other single publisher, but we also do a lot of work with University of Washington, Princeton University Press, MIT Press, University of Chicago Press, Prestel, Rizzoli, any number of publishers. So we produce the books, and then they're responsible for distributing them and getting them into the trade. In 2005, I was at a cabin my partner and I have outside of Yakima. It's about 25 miles outside of Yakima. And was taking long bike trips around the valley. And in April of 2005, I rode up the grade, intrigued by this little sign that said Tieton, and I went to the top of the grade. It's orchard country. It's very beautiful. Apples, pears, cherries, and apricots are the main crops. Of course, wine grapes a little further down the valley. Beautiful orchards, very, very successful orchards. Pulled into Tieton on my bike and could see that the town had really kind of fallen on hard times. It wasn't squalid, but it wasn't successful. It had obviously been, as so many small agricultural towns are going through, a period of dramatic transition. They used to be the center of a population of a bunch of family farms. That business has changed almost entirely to agribusiness. The number of family farms has dwindled significantly. And even though there's a population of about 1,200 people in the town, no longer was there the movie theater, the bowling alley, the bars, the general store, the appliance repair shop, the shoe shop, the variety, all those things. And again, this is a story that just plays out constantly as the economies shift. And so I pulled into the parking lot of a warehouse and ran into a bunch of goat head thorns, popped my tires, and in 10 feet I had 18 punctures. So I spent the rest of the day repairing the tires in the park in the center of town, and looked around, and there were all these storefronts. Most of them were empty. There were a couple of little businesses, a Mexican bakery and a little coffee shop run by an elderly woman who had been there for a long, long time, and a little tiny grocery store. But for the most part, the storefronts had been deserted. So I started thinking, well, property is so expensive in Seattle, and it's so hard finding studio space, it's so hard finding production space. What would happen if I brought a bunch of creative people from Seattle and we just kind of sat in the park, and we ended up that summer coming over, making many trips and imagining what we could do that might make sense of these spaces. By the end of the summer of 2005, the idea was to create this incubator for artisan businesses. So we bought a couple of warehouses, and then we bought a couple of storefronts, and we fixed up one of the warehouse with condominium lofts that we sold to some of the people who were coming over. And that provided a core group of committed people who were committed to making sure this vision of what we were imagining could succeed. All of the spaces we bought were empty. We didn't displace anybody from any of the spaces because we wanted to add to what was there, not change what was there, not take over what was there by any means. And that model is still in operation today. We have a 40,000 square foot warehouse where we have a letterpress studio, screen printing studio, laser studio, woodworking, metalworking. The sound artist Trimpen has a space there. We rent the space out for weddings and for quinceañeras and special events. We have events throughout the year. There's a Day of the Dead celebration at the end of October. There's a poetry workshop coming up in a couple of weeks that's now in its, I think, 12th or 13th year. We have a craft bazaar the first week of December where craftspeople from the area can show their wares, and that's become very popular. We have this mosaic studio, typographic mosaic studio that I'll tell you about at the end of my little program here. But this idea of an incubator for artisan businesses, what would my artisan business be? Well, so I started thinking, I know art books, I know the art world, I know museum people, I know designers and architects. What if instead of going electronic with publishing, we kind of went in the opposite direction and made objects? So the more digital people get, I think there's also a point to that. People want tactile, they want real objects, maybe not in large quantities, but they want things that will last and that are really special. An important part of this equation is that our basic business model is hands across the cascades. So the ideas, the ambitions, the customers, the resources, the connections come from the west side for the most part. But the production help and the jobs that we create happen in the community. So we hire people from the community, train them in these various skills, and we end up with people who work for us for years and years and years. The woman who we hired as a bindery assistant 12 years ago is now the manager of the bindery, and she has turned into one of the best production binders in the country. She had never done that before she started working for us. She's wonderful. 2 of the publications we've produced, soon to be 3, have been presented to the Pope. So for a Latina woman in this little orchard town to have the bragging rights that the work she worked on has been presented to the Pope is something special. And because of the jobs we've created, a couple of them have been able to buy their own homes. They've been able to send their kids to college. We've made a difference in their lives. But I will never lose sight of the fact that because Yakima is not in the center of a creative culture, it's mostly agricultural. There still are people who want to connect with a broader creative world. They know there's a creative world out there because of the internet, because of what they see. And they want to be part of it, but because of their family circumstances or economic circumstances or care of relatives, whatever, they have to stay there. They have to continue to support the family. So to be able to hire kind of the best and the most creative people from this group and to train them and have them work for us for years is something I could never do in Seattle. You know, there are so many hipsters who say, yes, I want to be the world's best baker, and after 3 months they're bored out of their minds and trying to find another opportunity doing anything but baking bread. But in Titan, be it the bindery or the laser studio or the letterpress printing or the mosaic studio, you end up with this caliber of employee that is really hard to duplicate anywhere else. I don't do the work. I don't do letterpress printing. I'm too much of a klutz. I'd lose all my fingers in the first 10 minutes. I don't do the binding. I can prototype, I can design, I supervise, but I'm completely dependent on the people from the community we've trained up, and that's an important part of the whole model. There was a nice group from Bainbridge who came to Titan last summer. We had a great time. We had a nice lunch, and I hope the museum puts together other groups so you can come over and enjoy it. And if you are in the area or thinking of making a day trip, if you contact us, mightytitan.com, or I can give you a business card, let us know. It's tough when people just show up, but if we have advance warning, we can put together a much more interesting tour of the facilities and show you a much better time. So this idea of creating Marquand editions, which is the handmade book component of my company, the idea was fueled not so much by my interest in creating content. So many of the book artists you see are really driven to express themselves, and it might be in a literary sense, it might be in a very personal, emotional sense. In my case, I work with all these extraordinarily talented people who, many of them have never even considered book arts as a vehicle for expressing what it is they do. That's how I wanted to set up the studio. So these are collaborations. You take some brilliant people who do amazing things and then figure out what's the best way using book arts to express their work and to connect with them on a more emotional level and a more personal level than a coffee table art book would ever allow us to do. So I have two books today that I'm going to show you, and they're really more objects than books. But I'm going to start with this one here. This one is called One Tree, and it started out at Codex a couple of years ago. A photographer came up, and we were introduced by a mutual friend, and he contacted me after Codex, and he said, I've been thinking, there's a woman who teaches at Stanford who is brilliant and one of the most important environmental people in the world. She's a good friend, and I'm a photographer. We go to Costa Rica frequently to study forests. He's a photographer, so he's along for the ride, but she goes regularly with groups of students to study the forests of Costa Rica. And there's a little village close to where she does a lot of her research, where there is one tree, one relic tree it's called. It's a survivor of what used to be a whole forest of them. And it's a ceiba tree. It's where kapok comes from. So we produced this book. He came up to Titan, and we produced this book in honor of this single tree. So we laser cut this in the laser studio. My assistant, Edward Armstrong, did most of the design work. He certainly did all the engineering for this. But we worked with the photographer and the scientist, Gretchen Daly. And this is a little book about the book itself. And this is her essay, Gretchen's essay. And the theme of the essay is that this village treats this one surviving tree the way we should be treating the earth. And that dependency and that connection is an important one. This village gets it with this tree. We could learn some lessons from this. Gretchen Daly is, she works for governments all over the world. She does consulting for the Japanese government, the Chinese government, the Vatican, and so one of these was presented to the Pope because she was at the Vatican and needed something to really impress the Pope. And then she also gave one to the Crown Prince of Japan. So these have fallen into some pretty nice hands, and the Bainbridge Island Museum of Art, of course. These are the photographs. There are, I think, 9 photographs of this, and they're digitally printed on handmade Japanese paper. And it has been collected by libraries and universities that have a strong environmental department and a book arts department. That's the kind of the nexus. And then it's also ended up in some very nice private collections. So we're delighted and honored. We did 25 copies of this, and there are, I think we've sold about 2/3 of them. And people always want to know, it's $2,800. So that's the that's what this is about.
So they're not hand colored, they're prints.
They're prints. Yeah. So this is a Japanese digital paper, and they're inkjet printed.
Okay.
And this paper is treated with a digital coating, which allows the inkjet ink to stay on top instead of to get absorbed in. So
Are they numbered for order or not?
there is an order to them, but it doesn't really tell any sort of narrative through that sequence. He basically just kind of went around the village and got the shots he could. So this is laser cut. This is recessed here. Because we have the laser studio, we can do this notching or this cutting around the edge so that the wood can take the bend.
What kind of wood is that?
It's walnut.
Okay.
It's walnut, and the wood on the tree itself is walnut plywood. But this is just a thin sheet. And obviously we wanted a wood that was sustainably grown and not chop down the last tree to make the book. So we just wanted something very simple, functional, handsome, and when I sent the photographer the photograph of our first little prototype, I just sent him just 2 little shots, and he called in 20 seconds, and he says, "Oh, we have to do this." And then he came up from Palo Alto, and we spent some time working together. And then he said, "Well, what about the case?" And so we came up with this, and I sent him a photo and said, "It's very Louis Kahn," and he's my favorite architect. So it really worked out very, very nicely for all of us, and he was a lot of fun to work with. The second is, and I can pass these around. Yes. Okay. And I'm happy to open this up, and you can come and inspect it. This is the work. This is about the work of a textile designer in Tokyo named Reiko Sudo, and she has a little shop in Tokyo named Nuno, and Nuno means fabric in Japanese. And I used to print a lot of books in Tokyo back in the 80s, and I always made a pilgrimage to this shop because it was just kind of magical. Not that I'm in the textile world, but the shop itself was just so sublimely beautiful. Over the years, we've developed mutual friends, and we finally connected a few years ago. A friend of hers, an American, said, well, you know, Reiko, 30 years, why don't you do a 30-year retrospective? And she kind of thought about it and decided she didn't want a book. She wanted to do something special. So she came over to Titan, and we talked and spent a couple of days imagining what we could do with the ends of production runs from 30 years of her work. These are not hand-woven things. These are machine textiles. So her work appears in interior design, big commissions for architects, interior designers, hotels, fashion designers. In this shop, people can buy yardage, and they can do whatever they want with the fabric. But she's known all over the world in the textile profession for being an extraordinary innovator. So we decided that a bento box metaphor was what made sense. And every layer would be a kind of a nice surprise. So in this, we just called it the Nuno box. And Matilda McQuaid, who's a curator at the Cooper Hewitt, wrote the introduction, and Alfred Birnbaum was the friend we shared. And the first tier has a biography of Rico, and we used her fabric. Instead of photographs of her fabric, we used the actual fabric. So in here, this is a biography of her. We tipped in some of her original drawings that were inspirational for some of the designs. This is all letterpress, and we stab stitched it, and then did the French fold paper. So I'll pass this around. And then this is a guide to the box. There are 140 different textiles represented in the box itself. And this is a guide to the pieces that don't have captions. So I'll pass that around as well. The first tier has 3 scarves. I should also add, this was done in an edition of 50, and we've sold about half of them. She decided that she would not do printed fabrics in this, but only things that involved unusual materials and unusual structures. So if you're in the textile world, those are the themes to be looking for. But these scarves, if somebody buys it, they can wear the scarves, or they could just leave them on display here. We've sold these to the Metropolitan Museum, the Library of Congress, the MFA Boston, the the Philadelphia Museum of Art, LA County, the Asian Art Museum in San Francisco, Bainbridge Island Museum of Art, and a number of private collectors. So I'll pass this around here. Obviously, the outside of the box is also done with her fabric. And then in her practice, she divides the fabrics by categories. So this one is called float. And she and her staff created these collages. And all 50 copies will be the same. So so all 50 copies will have the same collages. The frames are handmade Japanese paper, and we letterpressed the categories. This cocoon is fabric made from the remnants of the silk industry. So she's taken the waste products from the silk industry and figured out ways to repurpose them and take them a little further down the production chain. So even though they're not silky, they have many of the qualities of silk. So these fabrics, they protect from UV. They're very, very strong. They're very resilient. And for textile designers and interior designers and people really interested in fabric, this is really a treasure trove. You can inspect and really explore the qualities of the photographs, of the textiles. So, tell you what, I'm going to pass this down here. Sure.
Still in production?
Good question. Not all of them by any means. In fact, I'd say the majority are not still in production. The ones that prove to be popular and perennials, she would keep those going. But she's always innovating. She's just sort of insatiable, and is probably, just being around her, as lovely and charming as she is, I think she beats herself up all the time, trying to come up with new and inventive things to do. So this is an album of more textiles. The album has a few pages that are they're little short stories, very short little short stories, told in the voice of the textile. So Alfred was the one who came up with this idea, and these little short stories talk about being invented by Rico. So it's a fun literary conceit.
Who wrote the short story?
He did, yeah, he did. So
Oh my God.
this pleat, if you've been to the shop or if you're familiar with their work, her most famous scarf is something very much like this. But I've also seen, she did it's the hotel, the Mandarin Hotel, I think the Mandarin Hotel in Tokyo. And there are wall-sized dividers made with these things that are so beautiful, and they can uplight and do all sorts of amazing, fabulous things. So I'm going to pass this around. If you see a page where the fabric's folded in, don't worry, but straighten it out and make it neat. And then I think we can set this aside while that album is being passed. Then the last tier features many of the raw materials and tools she uses in production. So these are some of the threads. She uses stainless steel, copper. She uses, let's see, this fabric, or this thread here glows in the dark. A variety of silk threads, some very rough natural fibers, and she does a lot of work with paper, where the paper is woven into the cloth. A little bobbin. Here's some lace where the background dissolves off. You create the lace pattern, and then if the backing is dissolvable, either with water or solvent or whatever, you're left with this really lovely lace, but it can still be industrially produced. And here is a little model showing how the origami folds are made. It's actually pretty easy. I mean, easy for me to say. She takes 2 layers of paper and folds them origami style, and then flattens them out, and then puts the cloth down, 1 piece of cloth, and then refolds the paper, irons it, and the fabric is usually rayon, so it will hold the heat crease. Yeah. But she also figured out ways to change the color, so the heat can change the color based on the amount of direct and indirect heat. So very clever girl. So we can pass this around. And then there's another layer, more from the silk industry. These are the remnants from the silk industry. This would be on a spindle, and she creates this really beautiful silk paper. It feels more like a washi paper than it does silk, but in fact, it is made from silk. Here's a little cocoon. This is a teasel for distressing some of the surfaces. This little piece here is actually velvet before it's been cut in half. So that's kind of special. And then a jacquard loom pattern here. She often goes to villages, textile villages in rural Japan, and finds the factories that used to stay busy with kimono production. And kimonos are not nearly as popular today as they were in the previous decades. and so she finds things that they can help her create. So she keeps these villages going, and at the same time she's able to realize things that she wouldn't be able to using conventional manufacturing. So the case, the little trays there we made in the laser studio. They're made out of birch plywood, and the laser leaves a little char on the edge. So we ended up bleaching the wood after it was cut in bleach water for a couple of days, and that got rid of most of the char. The trays turned out to be the most challenging part of the production because, and birch warps and it shrinks and it expands and it does this and it does that. But we beat it into submission. But I think by looking at this, you can see I had nothing to do with the content. I really wanted to honor her talent, her skill, and her brilliance. But at the same time, what we're adding is the structure for it and kind of the editorial narrative. We collaborated back and forth, sending things back and forth to Tokyo. We met in New York once. And it took about 1.5 to 2 years to finally get the prototype to the point where we were both happy with it. I think we're very, very pleased with the way it turned out and gratified that so many curators have found it so attractive, and private collectors as well. So do any of you have any questions about the Nuno box?
We're fiber people.
Okay.
You're lucky they're passing it on.
Yeah. There's a video. If you're fiber people, there's a video. If you go to the LA County Museum of Art, and they posted I think an 8 or 9 minute blog post.
I saw it.
Did you?
Yeah.
Did you?
It was
Yeah,
wonderful.
yeah.
Yeah.
She did such a good job with that, and I was just dazzled.
Yeah.
She really studied it and knew far more about textiles than me, so that was a nice surprise. I didn't even know they were planning on doing that. It's really extraordinary work, and I'm delighted that the museum here has a copy, and it's in a good home.
It's a treasure. It's a real treasure.
We want to see this more to come. Who do I address this question?
Amy?
Can we make an appointment?
The text is really lovely too. I'm in a room of women. I think each of you would find the text inspiring on one hand and incredibly frustrating on the other, because so much of the story is the difficulty she had as a creative professional being taken seriously in Japan for decades. Male dominated. Clearly she is brilliant, and from day one, she proved her brilliance. But the part of the story that really just floored me was the difficulty, including quite recently, the difficulty she had running a business in Japan, even after decades of success and museum shows everywhere and so on.
This is fairly new. This is last year.
This is, yeah, but the story,
Right, her box.
yeah. The story, for example, when she wanted to get a loan, she had to put together a board of men to go with her to the bank. They did nothing. They were suits, they just showed up with her, and the bank needed their endorsement before they would lend this woman money. It's like insane. But so it goes. So I encourage you to if you do come back to spend time and really read the story, it's a pretty quick read and very well written. So this one here has a feather embedded in it, and that's especially nice. And the black one has the paper. Those are the paper strips that are woven in.
Is that pocket? Is that called
That's pocket.
I
Yeah,
love that.
yeah.
I don't know where it goes.
Oh, that goes with the
Right, but
scarves.
who hasn't-
With the scarves. Oh, they're
It's
down
good.
there. They're down
Yeah.
there. We're getting confused.
So is there, what kind of glue did you use, or how did you attach?
We used archival tape, so it's hinged at the top, and it's really good, sturdy tape. So that's what we did. The glue would have oozed through.
I was wondering.
Now, with the studio, we wanted to bind the cloth, use the cloth, and this is a paper cloth here. And you can't just apply binding glue and slap it on there, it oozes through. And so we have a dry mount press, and we dry mount a barrier. So essentially we're creating binding cloth out of the cloth so the glue doesn't ooze through. And it turns out was really pretty easy. Another aspect of this, since we're doing 50, and these boxes really have to stack neatly and tightly, we ended up cutting the binding board using the laser cutter rather than the shear, because even a little bit of variation could make the boxes stack incorrectly. And so that's one of the advantages of having the laser studio. So the laser studio we used for the trays, you see, but also to create the boxes itself. So that's technically one little detail. There's really nothing all that technically difficult about this project, except I'd say again the trays. The little trays were. Well, that's
Minor detail.
yeah. Well, negotiating and getting things back and forth to Tokyo and all the FedEx packages and the pulled hair and all that stuff kind of went away and all felt worth it when we finally finished it.
So are the trays birch plywood also?
No,
or
this is
are
binding board. Yeah, this is regular binding
So
board.
is there a reason you went to birch plywood for those particular
The look,
trays?
just the look. Yeah, we didn't want to cover them, and the binding board wouldn't have been,
Right, but the top of that is raw binding board, right?
It is, yeah. And we left the char on here. We have this, so there's, I think, 3 stacks of binding board here, and then this is cloth covered. And the nice thing about the laser cutter is that we can do these curves that would be really impossible to do by hand. And this very, this elegant little curve there. And Edward, my assistant, is the one who designed this, so I'm not flattering myself here. He really did such a
Do you have a
nice
size
elegant.
limitation on the laser?
We do. It's 30. I think it's 33 by 23 or 32 by 23, which is just fine for most of what we do.
Leaving that bookboard raw on the top is really a kind of multi-level statement.
Well, thank
I really
you.
love it.
It's
It's board, it's book, it's raw material, it's tree.
it just, there are some projects that just kind of fall into place. They don't come along often, but that's one where the decisions just all kind of presented themselves, and there was very little fussing back and forth and back and forth. We also do more conventional structures, very classic. We're doing one now for a photographer in Lisbon who photographs portraits of Lusitano horses. And they're so gorgeous. And the prints themselves are platinum prints. And the whole thing comes in this walnut box that unfolds, and there's a book and then a folio with prints. We're just doing, our part of it is just the book and the folio. There's some bronze plaques, or copper plaques, I guess we ended up with, that will fit on it. And it's very old world classic. You know, it's very grand. The pages are letterpress printed, and we've done 3 books for that publisher, and it's a real pleasure doing that as well. We've also done a number of projects for artists, individual artists who come to us with kind of a vision, and then we help kind of tighten it. There's one beautiful box piece for a paper sculptor, a guy named Mateo Lopez from Colombia, and ended up doing about 200 of these digitally printed but stab stitched French folded sheets of his drawings, these exquisite kind of little engineering drawings. We did that for another publisher. So on one hand, we can act as a production shop for other fine arts presses who don't have the capabilities of doing that kind of work. But we're not a job shop. So the bindery, if a printer calls up and says, can you bind 300 copies of a book? You know, no. We have to be involved in the design of the project and the conceptualization. When we have free time on our hands, or, you know, there is no such thing as a free lunch or free time, really, we're creating merchandise that we sell at the shop in Paper Hammer. And they're kind of cheap and cheerful greeting cards and funny posters and silly things. But it's really a lot of fun.
Was there any thought of photographs of how these fabrics were produced? You know, I mean, not produced,
Yeah.
what products they came out in, just to give
Yeah.
somebody that wasn't so aware what they could look like.
Well, that would be a worthy project. I think we were just so glad to crawl across the finish line that as it was. You know, with Reiko can talk about these things for ever and ever. She's extremely, you know, modest in that Japanese way. And so uncomfortable with her perfectly good English. I could just imagine how difficult it would be for her to struggle through something like that. And she's so busy. You know, I just don't think she sleeps. She just keeps going, going, going. There are a number of books available on her work, and they are available, I think, through the studio. Go to Nuno, I think it's nuno.com. I think you can order books. She has a rep in La Jolla, and he might be able to get some of those publications. Beautifully photographed, beautifully done, and they talk more about the manufacturing process. Any other questions?
Do you do workshops?
Workshops are a problem for us because Maria never learned in a formal way, and her English, she's very, very, she lacks confidence in her English. Now, the studio is also set up, and this is particularly true of the letterpress studio, because the letterpress studio isn't nearly as busy as the bindery. Our bindery is busy all the time. But the letterpress studio, we have great equipment. We have a beautiful Vandercook, a couple of C&Ps. We have some nice cases of wood type, a whole bunch of metal type. We have a polymer plate maker, And if somebody were to propose a workshop and to manage it, we would welcome a proposal like that.
I'm not an artist, I don't,
Yeah,
I
okay,
haven't
yeah.
started this yet.
You're looking for,
I want
you're
to.
looking for workshops, yeah. But we were asked all the time, and on one hand, if we had a different setup structurally, it would be a very good place for workshops. But as far as the manpower right now, we really don't.
Okay.
But it's really a wonderful studio, and I'm starting to talk to a couple of different people now about new projects kind of in this direction, and I love the idea that our studio will become known for doing this kind of book arts work, because it's pretty distinctive and unusual, and it's something very close to my heart. So,
No.
all right.
Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.
Yes.